Welcome back to Velshane Rule. The president's wrath has current and former members of the White House a little bit concerned today. I'm going to go a lot. This just 48 hours before Attorney General William Barr is set to release a redacted, that's the important word, version of the Mueller report. Multiple witnesses in the Trump-Russia investigation tell us that more than a dozen former and current White House officials are worried that the report will expose that they shared damning information about President Trump. Joining me now, NBC investigative reporter Carol Lee, who is behind this exclusive report, and former U.S. attorney and professor at the University of Alabama Law School, who I love to see in person, Joyce Vance. Carol, tell us more about this report, because when Robert Mueller calls, you're supposed to cooperate, and in fact, Trump's lawyers told people to.
Exactly, and their feeling now, some of them, is we were told to cooperate. We had no choice. Once you go in and you talk to investigators, you have to answer every question truthfully, tell them everything you know. And now they potentially could be criticized by the president, attacked by the president and his allies for having done what, in their view, they were told to do, which is go in and cooperate. And so they're worried, will their names be explicitly listed in this report and attributed to certain information, or will it be written in a way that, even if absent their names being disclosed, a way that you could tell where the information was coming from, and then will that get under the president's skin? And they're concerned about that.
Well, they can't be surprised by that. When they met with Robert Mueller and his team and told them everything, they knew that was a risk. And in fact, it seems like the risk has dropped significantly with Bill Barr as the Attorney General, because based on his testimony last week, he kind of seems like he's not ready to put it all out there.
Yeah, you know, he said that a number of things are going to be redacted, and the one that certain witnesses are focusing on is this idea of peripheral third parties, which he said, you know, if any of peripheral third parties, their reputations could be damaged, or if there was another reason not to disclose them, then he would redact that information. And so there's a lot of questions about what does that mean? Would that apply to testimony or comments that were given by witnesses? And generally, you know, I think their view is that there's not necessarily going to be some big explosive new fact that we don't know in terms of something that the president did, but there'll be more of the types of things that we've learned that the president did when it comes to obstruction, and that president will see that this new information, in the same vein of the things that we're come to be familiar with him doing in terms of obstruction, will then come out, and then he'll get really angry with them, and they'll be on the outs, and they'll be under fire.
All right, Joyce, separate what the right thing to do is and what the likely thing to happen is legally, because redactions to me are so important. We talk so much about this thing is 400 pages long, but if it's 400 pages of blacked out Sharpie marker, it's irrelevant. And to Carol's exact point, if they're going to remove information about peripheral people who are not being indicted, then this anxiety people are feeling for no reason.
Right. You know, so there is a legitimate scope for redaction, Stephanie. We don't want national security information disclosed to the public. We don't necessarily need to see information about ongoing criminal cases. This peripheral third-party language is not something that I'm familiar with from my work as a prosecutor.
Then what do we need to see?
You know, typically we don't release information on people who we consider for indictment but don't indict as it relates to that case. But this notion that the public and that Congress isn't entitled to a much more fulsome accounting is just wrong-headed. And that's the distinction that I would draw. This executive branch is giving the same information to Congress and to the American public. And certainly there should be a version that the public sees. Congress, though, is entitled to much more. They're entitled to see some of that national security information.
Legally entitled?
Legally entitled as part of their oversight function. And also, I think it's shameful that this Attorney General is refusing to go to court to get an order permitting him to share grand jury information with the Congress. That's also
for many
that should
reasons.
happen.
Many would say, well, this president has succeeded at being shameless. So why should we expect anything different in something that is consequentially, that couldn't be more important to him?
You know, I don't think we do expect anything better, and that's maybe the crisis of this presidency. This doesn't feel like a president looking at an investigation to me. It reminds me of a case I did as a prosecutor, a Dixie Mafia case, where the head of the Dixie Mafia organization, who was running a nationwide drug trafficking ring, as witnesses came into the government and truthfully testified, he in one case put a hit out, in other cases sent back his displeasure. And the president is acting much more like a mob boss than he is like a president, to the extent that he's questioning people in his organization who truthfully testify when they're called in front of a grand jury or to speak with federal prosecutors.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.